From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast, with workplace mental health becoming a priority for businesses who want to retain staff and prevent burnout. This is the source of information for creating sustainable and psychologically healthy workplaces in Canada.
Well, welcome to Psych Health and Safety in Canada. And today I'm really excited to welcome brand new mom, Elisabeth Cooke, who is the co-founder and CEO of Dignii. Now, when I first spoke to Elisabeth, I was really fascinated with the work that she's doing and the way that you can quantify where an organization is in discrimination, equity, inclusion, diversity, all of that stuff. And really, I want to get started welcoming Elisabeth, but getting her to explain sort of her journey and how this all fits into psychological health and safety.
Thanks. Well, I'll start out with my journey. I actually started working in mental health. I have an undergraduate degree essentially in counseling from the University of Victoria. So I worked in the mental health field for a long time, mostly with children and youth, and sometimes with their families. And then I went and got a Juris Doctor of Law, and I thought I was going to practice a lot of corporate law, but I didn't, despite really liking it. I decided that I wanted to practice doing things that would really support people. Would take care of people, and their mental health in the broader community. And I was quite drawn to, the ideas of diversity and inclusion, both personally and professionally. So I started consulting in this space and doing a lot of education and training and some policy analysis and advice. And then realized that there was a piece missing, and that piece missing, was looking at data, was looking at, who is actually in a workplace, and then what is their experience? Because when we don't actually recognize individual people, even in a qualitative or quantitative way, we're not really doing a good job. And we do that in business in all other areas. We do that. We do that with sales, and to a certain extent, depending on your industry, you do that with safety standards as well, particularly if you're a highly regulated industry, like if you look at oil and gas and what safety standards look like there. There's KPIs and ROIs attached, to maintaining health and safety. It's even on The Simpsons where they count down like how long it's been since you've had an injury. We do that, and we know about that because we see a value with that, because there's a monetary value, and there's also, a moral value as well of taking care of the people, that you work with. And, at Dignii, we're demonstrating really clearly that there is the same thing for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's what our company does. We've created the software to measure diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. And then through a bunch of different fancy tools that we've created, we pull up the intersectional data so that you can be more than just a woman. You can be a woman that has a disability or identifies as a lesbian or identifies as a person of color as well, so that we're not just siloing people. We're really looking at the true essence of all of the people in that workplace, and then digging deeper to understand what their experience is and respecting their privacy in that way, because that's really where we differ a lot in the data that we gather than what a lot of companies gather, is that, if somebody, has an injury at work, that's something that is counted in a different way than somebody that's experiencing harassment or discrimination, or where their psychological safety is affected in a different kind of way. So we do a lot of work around protecting the privacy and anonymity of everyone, so that they can answer, so that we can get that data to employers, so that they can understand who works there, and what the experience is of those folks, and what they need to create a more inclusive workplace to be able to capitalize on the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yes. And, the more that I dive into inclusion, which I've been doing a deep dive this year, the more I realize that it is completely intertwined with psychological safety, that ability to speak up, that feeling safe in the workplace, that ability to be heard. And when I think about measuring diversity. That's pretty simple. It's a numbers game. How many in this category, how many in that? Equity isn't too difficult because you're also saying, are people getting, their fair share? Inclusion, on the other hand, to me seems like the more difficult thing to measure. Can you help me understand, Elisabeth, how that gets done?
Yeah, and there's some different ways that we can do that. We use a science-based proxy. We use the Utrecht Work Engagement Survey, which has been applied several, I think, hundreds of thousands of times around the world. And it measures employee engagement in the workplace, which gives us a sense of individuals' sense of vigor, dedication, and absorption, and then provides us with a total engagement score. That is a particularly useful tool because it's a science-based proxy that's been used so many times, and we can benchmark that on different scores by industry, by geographical location, by level of seniority to understand, all of these different groups that we've measured with all of these diverse factors. What is their engagement? And then look at how that varies, because often, companies will survey and use all sorts of different surveys, from like a science-based proxy to little emojis on like how happy your face is and your experience at work, which is arguably not a science-based proxy. But using that and then saying, well, this is great. We've got 75% engagement across our entire organization. That's terrific. What we look at is, hang on, that's your overall engagement. What is going on for that 25%? Because sometimes when we're looking at good results, we forget about like the mistakes that we've made. We say, oh, I got 80% on the exam, isn't that terrific? What happened to the 20% of marks that you missed? What happened to that group of people that have low engagement? Who are they? And what we notice is that those groups are often those equity-seeking groups. So they're often groups that are women, are people that are more marginalized, that have had more historical barriers and systemic barriers to come up against. That's who sits in those categories. And when you look at the data and you realize that that's who that is, then you have an opportunity to dig deeper. So we use the Utrecht Work Engagement Survey as a benchmark for our data, and then we devise other probing questions. So it depends on the industry that we're working with. So we work a lot with, we work with the federal governments and local government, public and private nonprofit organizations, and how we understand those individuals' experiences varies based on the industry and the actual employer. So then we ask some further questions to probe a little bit deeper to understand what inclusion looks like. We also work with our clients to understand like where they are in their diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. And I tell clients all the time, because sometimes people call and think like, oh, okay, well, we'll just hire you guys and we'll do it for, this quarter, and then we'll be finished with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's like, well, no, it's not something that we're ever like, nobody's done. There's no corporation out there that's going like, we've finished it. Like we're at the end. we've nailed everything that we're supposed to nail. It's over. It's something that you're always working on in different forms. But when you have a rich data set that shows you who works here and what their engagement is, and then you start to measure that and you start to look at, like, well, we've run this initiative, or, we realize that we've asked our employees, where they see, different issues around like systemic barriers, because we say systemic barriers all the time, but what do you mean? What are you talking about? Are you talking about systemic barriers and that there's not a lot of, Indigenous people working in tech because there's barriers to school and to accessing the formal education that's often required to get those jobs? Because you need to really articulate that. Are you talking about inclusive hiring practices? Are you talking about, blind hiring? Like what is it that you're looking at? So we use more probing questions to understand exactly, what the level of inclusion is in an organization, and what are some of the areas that people that people think need to be addressed. And then we weigh that up, with what's happening with the employer and what needs to happen.
So one of the challenges that some employers have is just that the number of people that are in sort of equity seeking groups is so small that their confidentiality, their privacy cannot be protected in surveys. So in other words, you would know who's saying what. And how do you deal with that in a way that allows employers to make decisions and get information?
Yeah, that's a really challenging one. So when we're looking at it from a data perspective, we're usually looking at employers that have like a few hundred employees there, because we need to have enough of a sample size to be able to protect privacy and anonymity. What we often get stuck with is, we'll have responses that are less than 5, and 5 is usually the key number. That, if we disclose anything less than that, then we have a problem. What we need to be able to do is to really look at employers that have a workforce that's much smaller. They need to have different things. They need to have more hands-on work where you're dealing with individuals, because it's often coming down to like individual relationships. Give me the chair and just put it next to me. Yeah. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, that's okay.
We need to be able to look at employers that have a smaller workforce. They're looking at different policy considerations, or they're looking at more individualized training or executive coaching kind of things. When we see larger employers, and if they have a smaller amount of representation, then one of the things that's really important for people to realize is that if you don't see people being counted in the data, that can be an issue as well. So if you see that you don't have any Indigenous representation, don't think that you don't need to do things for Indigenous folks, because you do. You just don't have any of them there yet. So you're a little bit earlier in your journey with those folks.
Oh, or they're not responding to the surveys at all because they don't feel safe in doing so.
Well, we try, often one of the most interesting things that I see, in the data that's always very interesting to me is how many people select like prefer not to say. Sometimes people just look at the responses and they don't look at who's ticked prefer not to say. But when you see like dramatic increases in prefer not to say for sexual orientation or, gender identity or religion compared to other questions, people like, and we can see through our software, we can see that you've taken the survey. We can see that you've looked at the question. You've just chosen not to answer. Why? Yeah. Why was it only, 4% of people that chose not to say, maybe what their salary was, but when it comes to religion or to sexual orientation, people are picking like 9, 10, 11, 12% of your employee population doesn't want to answer those questions. Why don't they want to tell you that? That's the kind of stuff that I want to know a little bit more. And then that's what we work on for the next survey when we dig a little deeper, is trying to figure out those pieces.
So Elisabeth, when we have employers that say, oh, I don't want to know all that stuff about my employees, I just want them to do their job. Mm-hmm. Why is inclusion a good business strategy?
Yeah, and this is like the tricky selling point is that we've got like 15 years worth of business cases from most Western countries establishing that when you have a diverse workforce that's inclusive, where not only do you have representation of all those different groups to have diversity, but you have that inclusion piece, you have a mix of people working really well together where people feel a sense of dignity. When you have that, you do better. Like our research shows us that when you have an inclusive company, you have 6 times more innovation and agility in a company. And if there's ever a time in our world where we've needed to be more innovative and agile, it has to have been over the past few years of being able to respond to changes, in the world. We also see that inclusive companies are 3 times more likely to be high performing, right? So that if you run some initiatives to help people to work well together, you're 3 times more likely to have a high performing team. That there's a dollar sign attached to that as well, right? Same thing with, financial goals. Companies that are inclusive are 2 times as likely to achieve their financial goals, and they're 8 times more likely to have better business results than companies that don't have diversity and inclusion. So I often say people come to the conversation for DEI for 3 reasons. They come for the moral sense of wanting to do good. They come for the business case of realizing that actually you can make a little bit more money and have a better, stronger business and stronger brand. Or, for the legal obligations that you have, particularly in Canada, around human rights and employment law. But yeah, I mean, people are really are often quite challenged. And when you think about, the business case, there's a lot to get excited, about that. And we're often a little bit reluctant to talk about, the financial implications.
The thing about it is that if you're making the business case, those who are doing it because they believe it's the right thing to do will do it anyways. It's just an added bonus for them. But those who will not share their skepticism out loud because they don't feel it's politically correct, then at least we're convincing them that it's just a good business decision anyways.
Yeah.
And those who have already been caught in the crosshairs of human rights for not doing it well, they're pretty convinced anyways.
Yeah. Well, and if you think about it from a sales perspective, if the people on your team are only capable of marketing to people that are like them, you are dramatically reducing your potential customers, right? If you want to be broad and be able to reach all the demographics to get all of the money that you want for your company, you need to be more inclusive and diverse, right? And sometimes it's challenging to think that people only come to the table because they don't want to get sued, or they don't want to lose their job, or they only do the training, that we offer to teach them, how to be, quote unquote, politically correct, or, how to be an inclusive leader because they don't want to be in a headline or get quote unquote canceled. When people come to the conversation, they still have an opportunity to learn things. And I would rather people join the conversation than turn their nose up at it and have nothing to do with even trying.
I say I don't really care why people do the right thing. If they think it's just being politically correct, it's better than doing the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And you used a term, an inclusive leader, Elisabeth, and many leaders think that if they treat everyone the same, that they're being an inclusive leader. We know that's not true. Can you explain what an inclusive leader needs to do?
Yeah, so an inclusive leader really needs to understand the different folks that they have working for them. And I think actually really understanding that, when we talk about differences, we're not just talking about, what's on the headlines. It's not just the LGBTQ community. It's not just, thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement. It's not just thinking about, women's rights around their bodies and how they fit into, the workforce and what's expected of companies in that sense. It's really understanding that everybody is different by the mere nature of who they are, and looking at different ways to recognize that and appreciate that. That can go from like learning styles. We've seen big examples of this with a lot of our clients, where when everybody is moved to doing things online, some people have really thrived. Some people really enjoy the opportunity to work from home and work remotely and not have to engage in person. And we've noticed that anecdotally and in data, where we've seen several of our clients have the level of engagement for people of color, for women, and for people with disabilities. And disabilities was particularly higher during the course of the pandemic for people that had the opportunity through their type of employment to work from home, because they didn't have to travel. They didn't have to commute to the office with a disability. Especially like a physical disability, that group, it got a lot higher. People had more time. They didn't, necessarily have their different learning styles, different ways of engaging in meetings, really worked a lot better for some people. Some people it didn't. So inclusive leaders need to understand that everybody is different, and looking at being aware of that. So being open to hearing that feedback, because there's no cookie cutter response of being like, I'm an inclusive leader, so I'm always going to ask these 6 questions, and we're always going to do things this way, so that whatever it is that's going on for you, we're going to take care of it in this solution. That's not what an inclusive leader is. It's really recognizing that you have different types of people, and you'll need to have different types of responses to be able to engage them, in the best possible way, and understanding that there's a benefit of doing that. There's a personal benefit. There's some risk mitigation benefits as well, and there's some business case benefits.
Yeah. Now, 2 people I know that understand that concept are Kristen Bauer and Annika from Lida HR, and you've recently partnered with them. Can you tell me about what you're doing together?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm very fond of both of them. They're a delight, and they have such fabulous expertise, in consulting in this space, and especially around mental health and around working, with leaders, and really supporting, leaders to be more inclusive and to understand what their obligations are. As as human resources practitioners, and how to recognize the human rights of the folks that they work with. So we partnered with them, just as a value add to a lot of our clients. Often when we're coming up with recommendations for clients, there's a coaching element. Sometimes clients have those similar resources in-house, and sometimes they don't. So sometimes we might build a framework, or a strategy for people to use moving forward. And Kristen and Annika, are terrific at helping to do those pieces. And then when it's needed, providing more, sort of support in person, is very helpful.
And Elisabeth, what are the most common recommendations that you make to an organization that could do a lot better in terms of DEI?
Often it's a lot of training. That expression, "the road to hell is paved with good intentions," is always applicable, especially in this space. There really are so many people that want things to be better in the workplace, for everybody, whether that applies to their particular demographic or not, but they don't always know how to go about changing that. And it is an industry in and of itself of looking at diversity and equity and inclusion. It's a skill set that requires a certain level of expertise. So it's being able to share that, being able to set out a strategy. So usually, people, they want to know who's there, they want to know what's going on for folks, but they don't know what to do about that. We come in the door saying, you need this data. And then, the first step is saying, well, this is who's there. And these are some of the areas that you need to address. So it might be underrepresentation in certain areas that you want to be aware of. Inclusive hiring is often a piece there, which requires a little bit more work. And then looking at, especially as we start to dig deeper with our clients, as we do, subsequent surveys, to really understand a little bit more of, not only who are the groups that are not experiencing that level of engagement or that level of inclusion, and what is it that they need, if it's representation, if it's resources, if it's education. It never boils down to just one person, but sometimes it's like a general approach from management, or it's like a structure that's missing. I've worked with a few different tech companies, and sometimes they'll have good representation of hiring women and people of color, but the culture doesn't suit, that doesn't really it doesn't flow as well for everyone, where they've changed the representation, but they haven't changed the way that the company is working or doing business. And that goes for some of those groups as well. Like, I have plenty of conversations with I've had a lot lately with with women around like, how are they, especially around like inclusive leadership, like how are they doing their jobs, how are they being a different leader, and they have to challenge themselves personally, because a lot of the misogyny and sexism and racism wasn't just taught to all the naughty people that are misogynistic, racist, and sexist. We've all grown up thinking certain things as well. Like, I've been called all sorts of names because I'm a woman, and I feel like if I was a man, I would be called an assertive leader rather than being called like overly aggressive or something along those lines, because of how we perceive people to be. And there's an internal element for that as well. So Kristen and Anakin can help often with some of the coaching around there, but using the data to identify what some of those issues are is really useful. So it's a really beautiful partnership in that way, that we can inform each other's practice.
That's great. Now, you mentioned about inclusive hiring, and I've had employers say to me, well, we put the ad out, we don't get people from those groups applying.
Mm-hmm.
What would
That's
be
a personal favorite. Yeah, I mean, there's a reason that you don't have that, right? So we've really just talked about surveying employees. We've often gone and surveyed candidates as well, people that have applied for the jobs to understand what's going on there. Inclusive hiring, it's honestly like there's a lot of areas where things can go really pear-shaped really quickly. Everything from the language that you use in the job description, and there's a lot of research around the gendered language that's used in job descriptions that puts off, for example, women from applying to jobs. There's also elements of understanding a company's branding and what their reputation is, and what that looks like. We can see that sometimes by industry as well. Most people, if I asked you, like, what companies would you want to work at, people would know, and they're pulling on, their brand knowledge, their understanding of like what it's like to be an employee in that particular place, because people have a sense of that. So when we think about inclusive hiring, it's everything from, how a job description is drafted to what the company's representation actually looks like and what their reputation is, and then who's doing the hiring. What does that process look like? Do you have barriers in there as well? Also, not just how the job description is drafted, but like what are the skills requirements that you're looking for, and is that putting people off as well?
And you mentioned the idea that some people get that right, the hiring, but they don't change the culture, and it makes it very difficult for someone to feel that they belong, to feel that they fit in. And that going to work trying to be something or someone you're not every day is exhausting, and can lead to burnout, and certainly can lead to job failure in terms of that person being able to be successful there. If the issue is culture, what are some of the suggestions that you make that could be easier quick wins for the leader who wants to be inclusive, rather than big policy change that may or may not?
You really need to ask people in-house, because if you're looking at doing things to shift the culture, you're talking about changing the attitudes and the ways that people that are already there are behaving. So you need to engage them in that change. So sometimes that takes the form of creating employee resource groups that often will have like an executive sponsor that says, I might not know about this, and this might not be my cup of tea. I might be, that stereotypical older white guy, but I really do value diversity, equity, inclusion. So I'm going to use, the privilege that I have and the power that I have in my role to sponsor this group, and then work with that group to understand what it is that they want. Do they want to see the company doing things for, particular celebrations throughout the year? Does that group say, hey, actually, like, I don't need to do anything for Pride. That's a little bit of pink washing. I don't really have a lot of time for that. But I would really like it if we could actually, put some time to have everybody, including the people at the executive level, like do some training so they understand what language to use, so that, we don't have people making mistakes at the office Christmas party when they meet my partner and use the wrong pronouns, or, accidentally insult us, by doing something like that. You really need to ask in-house. So the employee resource groups, or in Canada, we often call them like diversity and inclusion committees with executive sponsorship, really goes a long way. Attaching some money to it. Because sometimes we say, sure, you guys can be in an employee resource group. Yeah, meet over your lunch hour. That'll be great. Have fun. Like, let us know how it goes. But then they don't give any money for the training, or they don't make it a priority in people's schedules by saying, oh, well, this is going to be something volunteer that we just add into your week, but you're still expected to churn out the same amount of deliverables. Change that, put some value, the way that we do value things, in business, by giving it a budget. It doesn't have to be a huge budget, but assign something to it. Those kind of things, those meaningful elements really start to shift a culture.
Yeah. Now, everybody in DEI knows what an employee resource group is, but not everybody that's listening here for about psychological health and safety will know. How would you describe an employee resource group, and how do you make sure you have the right people at the table?
Yeah, so this is really, not to throw out another term, but you want to look at who are some of the allies. Sometimes when we think about an employee resource group, we think, well, we're going to have one for the LGBTQ community. So let's ask everybody that lives and breathes in the LGBTQ community to come and be a part of this group so they can fix the culture. Like, the people that would attend that are not necessarily the people that have the problem. You need some other faces around there, right? We often ask the groups that are a member, of different equity seeking groups, and diverse groups to come in and, well, you figure out how to change this. So you want to have a mix of people. If it's an employee resource group that, is for, like, we have a lot of them in Canada for LGBTQ groups, for Black employees, for Indigenous employees, for a broader, people of color or Black Indigenous people of color. There's all, like, different workplaces have labeled them different things that suit what it is that they want. It could be, like an accessibility group. It could really vary, but it's a group that is targeted at looking at the particular employees that, have a passion and see a need to change things for that particular group. So it could be LGBTQ, could be, based on, being a visible minority or an Indigenous person or a disability or mental health. It varies by workplace. Sometimes you have one that represents all of those groups. If you have a huge organization, it could be all of those different ones. And then they work like a committee, like a working group to determine, what do they want to do to foster a greater sense of inclusion in that workplace. And one of the things that you want to make sure that you do is bring on more allies. So you don't just want to see a room full of Indigenous people trying to advance Indigenous awareness and rights in the workplace, because those folks aren't the ones that necessarily need to change their behavior. Their passion should definitely be harnessed. And if folks are willing to dedicate their time to help and educate other people, that's fabulous. But you do want to see a mix. You do want to see a mix of allies and a mix of, folks that identify with that group, because you all need to keep yourselves accountable to what it is that you're doing.
That's a great explanation. Now, you also used a term, pinkwashing.
Mm-hmm.
And lately, I've been hearing greenwashing related to climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And so can you explain what you mean by pinkwashing?
Yeah, well, if any of your listeners are on LinkedIn or watching this on LinkedIn, no doubt for the month of June, they saw most large companies with a healthy HR department changing the logo to have, some of the, like, the rainbow and like the pride colors that include the gender identity and sexual orientation. They changed the colors to represent pride. And if anybody, I feel like we haven't gone to, I think parades happened this year, but we haven't had parades in a long time. But you go to a pride parade and you see, like, at least I'm in Vancouver, and you see, like, the conservative political parties have floats in the pride parade here, as does, every municipality and level of government and large corporations. And the term pinkwashing comes from saying, you're coming and you're throwing some money at this and you're waving a pride flag for the month of June, but in actual fact, that your behavior on a day-to-day basis and the way that you treat your employees, or even your customers, or the values that you put out in the world, they don't align with supporting, like, for this example, like for the LGBTQ community throughout the year. So that's called pinkwashing. And then a similar thing is done for the environment, is saying, well, we're so friendly to the environment, but we're doing it to tick a box rather than I don't love the expression because it's based in religion, but practicing what we preach and making sure that we're doing those things on a daily basis, and that they fit the core of our strategy.
Well, and that's when we talk psych health and safety, the big conversation is that, organizations can check the box. Well, we put this in place. We have this training in place. We're doing these things. We have these processes. But behavior and the way we treat each other in the workplace never changes without actually focusing on that. And I think that we need to pick a color for psych health and safety, so I can call it something washing. but it's exactly the same thing, right? Is, are we actually changing behaviors? Are we actually changing the way we're supporting people in the workplace? Now, in terms of the work that you do, is it usual that people will take the results and take meaningful action? Or is it like many other assessments where they take it and they talk about it and it doesn't actually change?
I mean, I wish I had a lot more control in that process than I do. But I think one of the things that we try really hard to do at Dignii is to really connect with our clients, both with the representatives of the employer that have engaged us, and with all of the employees that have responded to the survey. And with that in mind, we try to give people a really fulsome understanding of what their workplace looks like, and that usually includes a lot of wins. We talk about a lot of things that there's that an employer is doing really well, and there's always something, and it's often things that they didn't realize they were doing really well. So when you can give someone like a full picture, you really can glean a lot of good information and strengths to continue to build on. So that's always a really easy, first cab off the rank, the low hanging fruit, the easy positives to bring on. We try to break down our recommendations into a broader strategy, because you can't do everything at once. And some stuff is going to be more expensive than other stuff. Inclusive hiring or like succession planning to have better representation at senior levels or at the board levels. That stuff takes time, and it takes a lot of planning and diligence to do that really well. So we like to, put things on a bit of a scale where you can see, there's some easy wins. There's some things that you can do in a measured, gradual way that are not going to break your budgets, that are reasonable, and then some other pieces further on. One of the reasons from that is that it's, in my opinion, logical. The other is that you'll see those wins build. You'll see that, and we see that from employees, where a lot of employees will message us, after doing the survey, and they'll say I'm really pleased to have had the opportunity to share this information with my employer, because I would never personally tell them that I have a mental illness, but I do want them to know about it, because there are some things that we need to change here. So, thanks for doing the survey and for keeping it private. I appreciate it. And then employers can see that, they can see how many people they have in their workplace with a learning disability, and think, geez, we need to, if we shifted this, it would really benefit this rather substantial group of employees that we have. And they never have to connect it directly with the employees. Having that, that bridge, like having a neutral third party facilitate that information sharing and provide those recommendations, it shifts a lot of things for employees and for employers, because we can protect the privacy like that. So when employees essentially can fill out the first survey, and they all of a sudden feel a little bit better. They're like, oh, I was actually able to share that information. And then when you give, companies that low hanging fruit of some easier steps that they can take, it shifts things quite quickly. And when we see that, it gives us a sense of optimism. It gives us a sense of hope, and we can see some incremental change, which helps people to get on board, which can shift the culture quite quickly. And even if things don't work very well, employees can see that companies are trying. It's like, well, they did that survey and they tried that, they tried to run this initiative. Like, it wasn't great, didn't work very well. It had these problems, but they're trying. It's not something that's being ignored. And that's a really positive thing that we see. So when we get people in with the, with the lower hanging fruits, and seeing that, it's you don't want to see it as a mountain to climb. It's not an end destination, it's a journey. And when they see that, and they start to see those those immediate benefits, people do get on board to change, because they see that it's not a threat, it's a benefit.
Yeah. And how would you say that we have progressed in Canada around the inclusion issue in the last decade?
I think, it's certainly towards the tail end of that, like over the last 3 years, and looking at the pandemic and looking at the hyper focus that we all had on our phones and media while we were all, not breathing on each other and staying home, and looking at the Black Lives Matter movement. What I think we've developed a greater sense of awareness, and we've, especially with smartphones, been able to understand the personal experience and the individual experience of people in a way that we never really did before. We would have people telling us stories, but now we can see things, especially with smartphones, especially when we look at, crimes that are committed against other people. We can understand a little bit more about their experience. I think it's also challenging because in Canada, we have a fabulous human rights framework, and a lot of protection for human rights, across the board in our country. But we also have the Indian Act that's still, an active piece of legislation, which is quite troubling. When we consider truth and reconciliation and what has happened and what, what we're trying to change, for Indigenous folks, in this land. And I think it is confronting, and we tend not to like to confront things a lot in Canada. We like to find, a more polite or palatable way to express or understand something. But I think that's slowly changing with particularly from a Canadian perspective, with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee and understanding the experience of other folks. We've had examples of harassment and discrimination that Indigenous people have experienced that's been recorded, and we can watch it rather than just, read a story about it. And we can hear what happens to people, and that can sometimes be quite traumatizing to have to hear, but it helps to foster a better sense of empathy, and a better desire to see things change. So I think we're always getting there. I think there's a desire in Canada to be more diverse and inclusive, and we're continuing to look at new ways of doing that, because there's always more fuel being poured on that fire.
Well, and I think back to when my mother, her parents were immigrants, and the way that she was stigmatized and called names and everything, and how then her background was Italian, and how Italian sort of has been integrated into the system. And then it's the next group of people who come and how they're treated. And so you think about all this, and you think about that the Indigenous people were here first, and yet they're still experiencing this kind of treatment. Seems really unfair, really something that we all have to address and improve.
Yeah, I think too, I will say that I think one of the things that, certainly I've been trying to focus on in my own personal life is around, looking at all of the incredible stories of strength and bravery and leadership from the Indigenous community. I'm obviously a nerd. I really like I'm particularly fond of governance, and looking at how we govern, and the system of governance, in the traditional system of governance in Indigenous communities, I find fascinating. And the strength and resilience that community has exhibited, despite incredible trauma and atrocities that have taken place, is actually really incredible. And we should spend more time focusing on that strength. Like it's, I think it's very important that we come to terms with, and we do look at a way to reconcile, some of the awful things, all of the awful things that have happened to the Indigenous community. But to me, what's, I don't know if it's fair or right for me to say equally as important, but what I find personally appealing is seeing the strength, within those communities. Because that's something, like when I think about, teaching my little children, or my little nugget that's hiding down here, like those stories to me are phenomenal, because if I imagine anything about being on the receiving end, we're trying to be empathetic and understand the experience of Indigenous people. Like, we can't really get through imagining it. But what stands out to me is the strength. So I think looking at, the different things that we can gather from those situations is really important.
Well, a few years back, we started a project that was given a name by an Ojibwe elder, and it's Mino Sewin, which means to set it right properly. So we went into this, which is collaborating with folks within the Indigenous community, originally to see how do you recruit and retain Indigenous employees. But what I've learned over the years of working with the group is exactly what you're describing, is that whatever we do with them, whatever they do, ends up being good for all people. So we learn from them, and we build with them, but then we realize that it has a much broader application. Yeah. So it's thrilling to be able to think about what's possible, about making things that are so-called mainstream, and collaborating with the Indigenous community to make it better for everyone.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because often I see people looking at, diversity and inclusion as like silos. Even when we talk about like employee resource groups, it's like, okay, well, this month we're going to do things for women, and then next month we'll tackle people of color, and then we'll do it. Actually, like, well, the shift in culture that we're talking about kind of applies to everybody. Yeah. All of those groups do need to be recognized, and we do need to understand, the uniqueness of the experience of a lot of the folks in there. But a lot of the solutions come from the same place. And when we step back and look at that and appreciate that, that's what we mean when we shift the culture, because we can't be going through, it's not even economically feasible. And this, I'm saying this as somebody who works in the industry, like it's not going to work to, revisit the wheel every time you get a new group of people that you realize works for you, or immigrants from like a new place that have come and they're not feeling, like they're engaged in the workplace. It's coming from the same place. So that when you have that strategy and you have that framework and that's how you've integrated that approach into your business practices across the board, you'll see the ripple effects throughout the entire organization. You see it in the creativity, you see it in the communications, you see it through HR, you see it in sales, like it travels through a business because there's benefits for everybody in that process.
Yeah, beautifully said, Elisabeth, really beautifully said. So my final question for you is, I believe inclusion and psychological safety are very similar. If somebody was asking, well, what would it look like if I was in an inclusive or psychologically safe workplace? What would I see, hear, or experience? How would you describe that?
To me, it's a place where we're really looking at an individual's dignity, where we're really looking at just respecting a person's dignity and their life and their experience. And I think it calls on people to take a moment to pause and appreciate the differences that are around us. And sometimes we forget to do that with people because people can annoy us, because people are different to us, because we're in a rush. But I often try to think of it as being, like food. When we go, I really like trying different kinds of food and, having, a different culinary experience, which I think a lot of people can appreciate. And I think if you limit yourself to just one option, you're not going to have a lot of fun. And I think most people would say that, like, I love pizza, but I don't need to eat it for 3 meals a day, every day during the week. I need to be able to appreciate all of the different kinds of things that are out there. And I need to take pause to recognize all of those. So when I think about people being different, especially at work, I think about that. There's different options, there's different skills, and there's different experiences that we can get. And when we take pause to recognize and respect the dignity of everybody that we work with in how we treat them as individuals and as groups, then we're doing well, and we're looking at a better way of including everybody, and also respecting everybody's, frankly, right to psychological safety in the workplace.
That's beautiful. So thank you very much. If somebody wanted to get in touch with you to learn more about what Dignii does to gather data, how would they do that?
Yeah, they can find us through our website, which is dignii.com, dignii.com, or you can email me directly at elisabeth@dignii.com, and it's Elisabeth with an S, which throws a lot of people off. But you can find us through our website, or reach out, to me specifically, and we can have a chat about, a little bit more about what it is that we do at Dignii, and tell me a little bit more about workplaces, because I'm obviously really interested in them, and no two are exactly alike. So I'm always keen to hear about new environments.
That's great. Thank you. And to the listeners who can't see Elisabeth, she has done this podcast with a 3-week-old baby in arms, and it just proves the strength and versatility of this individual. And I'm really quite amazed and thrilled that you could do that. So thank you very much. There will be clips of this on LinkedIn. And I'd like to thank you, Elisabeth, your child, and People Diagnostics and Flourish DX who sponsor this. So thanks very much, and have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in North America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.